thank you everyone for being here today. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to have been a visiting fellow here for 2 months at Maharaja's College. I work at the University of California, Riverside, close to Los Angeles in the United States. And I'm especially privileged and honored to be here speaking today because later this afternoon I have to go back to America on a flight. So I'm glad that the timing worked out and I had an opportunity to share some of my research with you. So my topic doesn't deal explicitly with the issue of refugees. It deals more so with the issue of resistance. And the Naxalites are, of course, one of the major resistors of the Indian government over the last several decades. And so I'm happy to talk about this with you and look forward to your thoughts. So first, I just wanted to say that my presentation is based on this paper that came out earlier this year in Politics and Society. It's a political science journal in the United States. There's a link to it on my website, but if you want a copy, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to send you a copy. Conquest and Conflict, the Colonial Roots of Maoist or Naxalite Violence in India. First, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Naxalite Insurgency. So here's a very famous photo of a meeting. As you can see, it's in a thickly forested or jungle part of India, and this is a Naxal cadre, and they're having a meeting. This is the CPI Maoist. And so this has been one of the major insurgencies that has existed in India since the 1940s. So if you're not that familiar with the Naxalite insurgency, I'll just start by giving a little bit of detail about this movement. So I think there are different ways that scholars have described the various movements of this Naxalite insurgency. I would say that there are probably 3 movements, or you could say kind of 4 different historical periods in the insurgency. So there's a kind of prehistory that we talk about that goes back to the 1940s. So really the organizational capacity of the Maoists is rooted in the Telangana movement in the 1940s. So this occurred in Hyderabad state, in Nizam's Hyderabad in the 40s, and you had a communist insurgency in this area, especially in the rural kind of hinterland part of Hyderabad. These are areas where you had very powerful landlords who in rural areas were highly exploitative, both in an economic but also in a sexual sense, exploitative of women. These are landlords that were kind of the rural support system for the Nizam. And so in the 1940s, the Communist Party begins to mobilize villagers around their economic and social status, and creates an insurgency in Telangana that really lasts up until the, even after the independence of India in 1947. So while we don't typically think of that as the beginning of the Naxalite movement, I would say that was where a lot of the organizational capacity of the Maoists came from. The technical beginning of the Naxalite insurgency is in 1967. And the insurgency gets its name from the village in West Bengal of Naxalbari. And so this is another revolt that happens against, it's primarily targeted toward high caste landlords. And this is actually a revolt that's instigated by a tribal group, the Santal tribe. But there are also a number of low caste peasants who are involved in this initial period. So that's typically considered to be the beginning of the Naxalite movement. And that only lasts for about 4 years before many of the leaders of the Naxalites are put in prison and they're killed, and the movement is then crushed. So the second movement is from 1971 to 2004. You have a very long period of reorganization where it's not really clear what is happening to the Naxalite movement. And there are some Indian officials that even refer to it in the 1990s as, quote, a minor irritant. And they treat the Naxalite movement very superficially. So what happens then in the third movement in 2004 is you have a reorganization of the Naxalites under the CPI Maoist, and a shift from just primarily focusing on peasants who are of lower caste or scheduled caste in this instance, and a move towards trying to bring in tribal groups, especially scheduled tribes. And a movement, geographically speaking, from West Bengal and Bihar, which is where some of the earliest movements are, down into more forested or thickly forested parts of India, such as Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. So that is the third movement, which is, I would say, ongoing, although we'll see some variation in how much conflict there is across India. So I just wanted to show this graph. This is based on the South Asia Terrorism Portal, which, if you're interested in this topic, they have a lot of data available that's based on press reports. And you can see from 2005, if you just focus on the blue line, that's the total number of casualties, people who have been killed in the Naxalite conflict. So you can see it peaks at around 2010, and then afterwards we see a steady decline, but you're still seeing hundreds of people every year killed in this conflict. Around this peak of the violence in 2009, 2010, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh says at the time that the Naxals are the gravest internal security threat that the Indian government has ever faced. So especially during the last Congress government, it was a major problem that they had to deal with. So obviously, one major question that people have is, so what is the cause, or what are the causes of this Naxalite conflict? How did it begin, and what is sustaining this conflict over time? So this slide could have hundreds of different authors, but I'm just trying to summarize a few main ideas here. So one common thread in scholarly research on the Naxalites is the idea of underdevelopment, right? The idea that especially many of the areas that see Naxalite mobilization are underdeveloped. They don't have infrastructure such as roads or schools or bridges or hospitals. And so therefore you have people who have lots of grievances against the government, and so they might be mobilized towards insurgency. So underdevelopment is a major cause, some scholars say, of the Naxalite conflict. A second cause that a lot of scholars have focused on is mining and mineral wealth. So if you just look at a map of India and see where most natural resources are, such as iron ore, or bauxite, or various other minerals, and you were to put that over a map of the Naxalite conflict, it would match pretty well. Right? There's a reason why so much of the Naxalite conflict is in Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, because these are areas with a tremendous amount of natural resources. So maybe it just has to deal with where these resources are located. So a third argument would be about economic inequality. So not just poverty, but what is the level of inequality between different groups. And so obviously, especially when you're talking about scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, you're going to have areas with high levels of inequality. And so maybe this is a cause of the conflict. And I just have a few citations here from political scientists, but also a lot of economists have studied this topic. And then the last argument, a more recent argument, is about political exclusion. The idea that many of the groups, social groups that are involved in the Naxalite conflict are politically excluded. They don't have parties that cater to them. They don't have a lot of representation in government. So especially if you think about scheduled tribes, many of the Naxalites today come from the scheduled tribes. They're considered the backbone of the movement. These are groups that are not politically represented. And so if they don't feel like they're represented, then maybe their only option is to use violence in order to get people's attention. So I think all of these causes are likely to be true. I don't think any of them is wrong per se. But my co-author and I, when we were reading this literature and we saw a lot of these articles and books coming out on the Naxalites, one thing that struck us was a lack of a historical perspective. The thing about tribal rebellions in India is that they've been around for a very long time, right? So anyone who says that the Naxalite movement, like I've said, begins in the 40s, obviously historians would say the 1840s, right? There have been a lot of these conflicts throughout history, and so here's the famous Munda Rebellion, right? So you've always had peasants of a low caste or tribal origin rebel against more powerful states. And at this time it was the colonial state, and now it's the post-colonial Indian state. So the question that we wanted to deal with, the main question that we're asking is, what is the effect of British colonialism on the Naxalite insurgency? So that's really the central question that we're asking. So as soon as I say this question to you, most of you will probably say there was a very large effect, right? Of course, colonialism is a cause of the Naxalite insurgency. That just seems like common sense. It seems very intuitive that during the colonial period you had rebellions, and now you still have rebellions, and so maybe there's a lingering colonial effect. The problem with the intuitive nature of this argument is that there are inferential problems. That means there are only certain kinds of causal inferences we can draw from the existing data. So I'll just ask you one question. So if you think that colonialism clearly helped to instigate the Naxalite conflict, I would say, how do you know that there wouldn't have been a Naxalite insurgency even if there was no colonialism? Right? So even if the British had never come to India, are we sure that there wouldn't have been some kind of Naxalite rebellion? Maybe it just would have been, it would have occurred in some different way. It would have been targeted towards somebody else. But another way of putting this is, how can we actually show a causal effect? What is the comparison? So we say the British came to India, then you had the Naxalite conflict. So if the British had never come to India, what would have happened? But how do we make that comparison, right? Because that is a counterfactual. That historically never happened. So we can't really know what is the true causal effect of colonialism because there's no comparison group. So what we try to do in the article is say that we can take advantage of this map. This is the map of what British India looked like, which the political advisor to the last viceroy said this is what the British thought of the map. He said this is definitely the oddest political setup in the history of the world. That's the way he described it, the map of British India. But this map helps us overcome these inferential problems because the British did not rule all of India directly. They only ruled parts of India directly. Those areas are called provinces. And so if you were to compare provinces with areas that the British ruled indirectly, that is princely states, which of those areas have more Naxalite conflict today? So that is a kind of counterfactual that we can make. So of course, you know, if you look at Kerala as a great example, you basically cut the state in half, and the northern parts, Malabar area, is ruled by the British, and then you have the Cochin area and then Travancore that are ruled by native kings. So you can compare these groups. They might not be perfectly comparable, but you can compare them to see what kind of conflict do we have in each areas. And that's one way we can examine a kind of counterfactual. So that's methodologically what we try to do in this article. So let me just show you what this actually looks like. So there are 4 maps here. So in the top left, we have a map of Maoist organizational capacity that is non-violent. What we mean here is areas where the Naxalites have tried to organize. Okay, so some of these organizations didn't work, they failed. You can see in parts of northwestern India, for example, the Naxalites tried to organize. But those are areas that don't really have a lot of violence. So we just look at first, where are the Naxals organizing? You can see it's mainly along the eastern, from the northeast to the southeast part of India. Then the map to the right, in the top right, is Naxalite violence. Okay, so these are areas where you have had people killed in the Naxalite conflict. And as you can see again, it's mostly in eastern India. So then in the bottom left, excuse me, The bottom left, you see areas that are directly ruled by the British. So they are shaded. So all of the white areas, like you can see Hyderabad, all of the white areas are areas that never came directly under British rule. So if you just compare this map and the other two maps, you can see some areas that were under British rule have a lot of Naxal conflict, like Bihar and West Bengal, for example. But you also have areas like Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh that were mainly princely states, and they also have Naxalite conflict. So the map, it's not exactly clear what the map is telling us. There are some British areas that have violence, but there are also some princely areas that have violence. So it's hard to draw any inferences directly from the map. The very last one in the bottom right is a measure of gun salutes. So each princely state in India was given a gun salute. And these range from 0 all the way up to 21. So Hyderabad, for example, had 21. I believe Travancore had 17. 19. So you can see the darker areas are the areas that have higher gun salutes. So Hyderabad, for example, and then a lot of the states in Rajputana or modern day Rajasthan. So that's a measure of how independent princely states were. So a state like Hyderabad has a lot of independence, but a lot of the northeast, the states where the Naxalites have control have very little independence. They have a lot of British influence. So I'll talk more about this in a second, but first I just wanted to show you what the map looks like. Okay, so that gives us some indication British rule is having an effect on the Naxalite conflict, but it's not exactly clear what the relationship is. So what we then do, I know this is hard to read, but we spent about a year or a year and a half of just collecting as much data as possible on Naxalite conflict, but also a number of other variables that we think are that affect Naxalite conflict. And if you're interested in this research or want to know more about the research, all of this data is on my website, and it's all publicly available, so you can download it and use it if you want. Feel free to ask me how you can get a hold of this data, but everything here is publicly available. So the first group of variables we have here are just a bunch of different measures of conflict. So we have measures of the Naxalite conflict because you can't trust any one measure. We have measures from the Ministry of Home Affairs, which obviously collects information about the Naxalites. We have it from the South Asia Terrorism Portal. We have it from another, the US government was actually collecting data on the Naxalites at one point. It's called the Worldwide Incidents Tracking System. So we also collected data from there. And so that way we just look at every district in India, which at the time we were collecting this, there were about 589. And then we look at whether there was Naxalite conflict or organizational capacity in each of these districts. Then, in order to measure British influence, what we do is we have a few different measures. So one is we just code a district as having been under British control or princely control. So it's just a dichotomous variable. But that lacks nuance, right? No historian would say that you just have princely states and provinces. There are different kinds of provinces, different kinds of princely states. So another thing we do is we look at the number of years that a territory was under British rule. So some of these areas, I think one of the earliest areas in India was actually the city of Mumbai, which was given as a wedding present in the 17th century. So it's like almost 300 years of, at the time Mumbai was actually not considered good real estate, so it was not, nobody knew how expensive real estate was going to get in Mumbai, but it was a wedding present at the time. So that has almost 300 years of British influence. But there are lots of other areas that are annexed right before the rebellion in 1857, after which the British don't annex territory anymore. And so those areas only have about 90 years of British influence. So for each British area, we record how many years they were under direct rule. And then for all of the princely states, we record your gun salute, whether it's 0 or 5 or 7 or all the way up to 21. And we assume that the states with the higher gun salute have more independence. They're bigger, larger states. And states with a smaller gun salute, like 7 or 9, those tend to be states where you see a lot of British interference. And then the last set of variables we have are things that we think are associated with violence. So in each district, we look at the percent of households who say that they don't own any assets. So if the households who say we don't have a bank, we don't have any access to banking, we don't have a motorbike, we don't have a car, we don't have a TV or a radio. We look at the percentage of families who, according to the census, say they don't have any of these things. We look at the literacy rate. We look at whether there's mining in a district, if there's any kind of iron ore or bauxite mining. We look at the measure of land inequality, so the Gini coefficient for each district. We look at the percentage of people in a district who belong to a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe. We look at just the total population, soil quality. So we have a lot of different measures that we are looking at. So this article was something we started in 2011, and we didn't get it published until earlier this year. So it took a long time to collect all of these data, but now the data are available. So why do people join the Naxalite movement, right? So here are just some basic graphs I'll show you of how colonialism, the basic argument is it generated grievances among certain populations. Especially if you're a scheduled caste or you're a scheduled tribe, colonialism generates certain grievances, makes your life worse, and that may make you susceptible when a Naxalite organizer comes to your district and says, why don't you join this movement? Now you are susceptible to that method of organization. That's the basic theory. So in the top left here, we say the more, so what we're looking at is how long areas were under British rule. So in the top left, what you see is the longer you are under British rule, the more land inequality you have in a district. So the longer the British are there, they exacerbate land inequality. What that means is they concentrate power in the hands of high caste landlords, zamindars, for example, and then land inequality tends to increase in these areas. So we can show that statistically. To the top right, there's a measure in the Indian Human Development Survey where people are asked how much caste conflict is there in your neighborhood. Do you feel like people from different castes get along, or do you feel... So it's a subjective measure, but we're asking how much caste conflict exists in your area. And we can see, again, there's the fact that the slope is going upwards indicates a positive relationship. So areas that are under British rule for longer amounts of time tend to have more caste conflict. So you have more tension between different caste groups, which is exactly what you would expect, right? Now, in the bottom left, the Human Development Survey asked the question, how much confidence do you have in the police? The police is a colonial institution, right? You had the colonial police, and then that becomes the post-colonial police, right? So the British are really the first one to set up a national kind of structure of police. So the longer you are under the control of the British, the less confidence you have in police, right? So if you live in an area that the British have ruled for around 300 years or 200 years, you tend to have less confidence in the police than an area that was never ruled by the British, or only ruled by the British for 90 years. Now, why would that be? Because, again, the argument is that the British used the police as a kind of tool to keep certain groups, social groups, down. Okay? But we also look at this in terms of post-colonial institutions. So how about state governments? And we see there in the bottom right, there's the line is flat. So that means there's no relationship. So if you've lived under colonial rule for a very long time, that has no effect on how you feel about your state government. Because the state government, those governments came into power after colonialism. So what we can show is people feel worse about colonial institutions, but not post-colonial institutions. Okay? So we think we made an argument for the fact that there are certain grievances among populations that is due to colonialism. So then we look at all of our data that we have on violence, and we say, what is the effect of colonial rule on violence? So this is the main kind of specification that we have in the paper. And what we see here is basically, if you want to put it in percentage terms, going from a princely state to an area that has 200 years of colonial rule triples the chances of this district experiencing Naxalite violence, right? So if you have, let's say, like a 10% chance of your district having Naxalite violence, if this area was ruled by the British, then that jumps to around a 30% chance of having violence. Okay, just now, again, these are statistical models, so there's always estimates of uncertainty. I'm not saying we've proven this, we're just saying that this is what the estimates show. So you can see the amount of, like, the organizational capacity of the Maoists increases the longer you are under colonial rule. And then the same occurs for violence. So in this comparison between provinces and princely states, if you happen to be born in an area that is a princely state, then your chances of experiencing Naxalite violence are very low. But if you were to then move to an area that has been under British rule, then your chances of, even your chances of being involved in this conflict about triple, right? So that's a very large effect. So we think that that's very strong evidence that colonialism is affecting Naxalite violence. I won't go so far as to say causing, but we'll say that it's clearly having some kind of there's an important relationship between these variables. Now, when we first wrote this paper and we used to deliver it at conferences, the number one question we would get from other political scientists, they would say, what about the red corridor, right? That is the area that's shown on this map that is mainly, it's called the red corridor because it's, you know, in this eastern corridor region of India. But some of the worst violence that we see is actually happening in princely states. So people always used to criticize us and they would say, your argument is British rule increased Naxalite conflict, but the worst hit area in all of India is Bastar, which is a former princely state, right? So people would say, well, how do you explain this argument? How do you explain this map? Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh are areas that are, as you can see, according to the Ministry of Home Affairs, they have different ways of coding districts. So they say marginally affected, moderately affected, highly affected. So the most highly affected areas are in princely states. So how do we explain this? So our response is to go back to the idea of gun salutes. So our argument is not really about British rule per se, it's about British influence. Because you have influence even in princely states. So we'll give you an example, okay? So here's just like a 2x2 diagram. On the top you have direct and indirect rule, and on the left you have high British influence and low British influence. So we would say a place like Medinapur in West Bengal, that has been under British rule for about 190 years. So we would say for almost 200 years the British were here, they were building institutions, they were changing society. There's a high level of British influence. But a city like Lucknow only has about 90 years of British influence. It came under British rule right before the rebellion of 1857. So Lucknow has British influence, but it's lower compared to other areas. That's the argument that we would make. The same thing would apply for princely states. So what's a princely state that would be very free of British influence? You can think of Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh. So it has a gun salute of 21. Okay, so it's a state that the British did not really want to interfere unless they felt like they absolutely had to. In a state like Gwalior or in a state like Hyderabad, in a state like Hyderabad, right? So the amount of British officials there, or just kind of the interaction British officials have with native authorities, we would say that there was less British influence in those areas. So what is a princely state that has high British influence? The prototypical example is Bastar, which is a part of India that was a princely state but was actually ruled for about 76 years by British officials. And the British, if they wanted to directly rule a princely state, they usually sent Indian officials to govern it. But Bastar was actually governed by white English men, which is highly unusual. So what we then show is that even within the Red Corridor, our results are the same. If we just focus on areas that the Ministry of Home Affairs calls the Red Corridor, these areas still have more Naxalite conflict. So those are the two graphs at the top. The longer you are under British rule, the more Naxalite violence you have, even just within the Red Corridor, just eastern India. And then the bottom two graphs show that the higher your gun salute, the less Maoist violence you have in India. So it's the states like Bastar, which the chief of Bastar asked for a gun salute. He wrote to the British, "I'm entitled to an 11-gun salute." And the British wrote back and said, no, and did not give him any gun salute. And so the state technically has 0. So it's the states that have very, very low gun salutes that have a lot of violence. And we would say those are areas where the state British influence was very high. So our argument is really kind of more about British influence than it is just about direct rule per se. Okay? So I'll just conclude by making 3 points. So the first point is that I hope that I've convinced you that areas of British direct rule, that is the provinces, have more Naxalite conflict than areas of British indirect rule. And I think if you really want to try to isolate the effects of colonialism, whether it's on the Naxalites or economic development or any other number of variables you might be interested in, social, economic variables, one way to think about colonial influence would be to compare provinces and princely states. That is the closest thing we have to a counterfactual of what happened if the British had never come to India, right? It's not a perfect counterfactual, but it's the closest thing that we can get. The second thing I'll just re-emphasize is that the key variable we should think about is British influence. So you start with this province-princely distinction, and then you think about within provinces how much British influence is there, within princely states how much British influence is there. And then that really helps you get at a more nuanced measure of how the British affected Indian politics. And then the last thing that I'd say in terms of a narrative, because many of the people who are interested in this question are historians or sociologists, what we try to say in the article is that there's a two-step process. Colonialism generates caste and tribal grievances, which is a term you very often hear in economic literature, right? The different grievances of ethnic groups. And so it creates these grievances, that means land inequality, grievances towards high castes, grievances towards the police, right? Very often people feel like the police are discriminatory towards low social status groups. So the first step is colonialism generates these grievances, and then once you have an aggrieved population, they are susceptible to mobilization by the Naxalites. And that's what we see starting in the colonial period with the Munda Rebellion and all of these other rebellions, and then continuing into the post-colonial period all the way up until 2010, 2011, but even every single year today, you have people killed in the Naxalite conflict. So I will end there. I look forward to your questions, your critiques, your comments, and thank you for the time you've given me to be here with you today. Yes, okay, thank you for those. Those are two good questions. So the first question about the composition of Naxalites. So I guess I would draw a distinction between who are the leaders of the Naxalite movement, and then who are what we would call foot soldiers, who are the kind of everyday people in these dalam, in these cadres. So I do think you're right that for almost all rebel groups, not just the Naxalites, but rebel groups in every country, are generally organized by well-educated urban people who have a higher social status. It's the everyday rebels, the people who are actually fighting and dying, who tend to be from lower social status. So this is also true for if you think about the colonial, the movement in Bengal, right? So most of the leaders of the movement were well educated, and many of them came from high caste families. But the people who are at the street level are really kind of usually socially lower groups, lower status groups. The second question that you asked about neo-colonialism, so that's not a term we use in the paper, but I think you could make the argument, especially with mining, that the Indian government has privileged certain kinds of mining contracts to foreign companies to strip mine different areas where there are lots of tribals living there, and there are lots of villages. And so because of the Indian government making these agreements, very often entire tribal villages are just relocated. So you've lived somewhere for hundreds of years, your family has lived somewhere, and then the government says we are going to have what was it? The way it was described here was mindless development, right? So the government is just going to move entire villages and disrupt people. And so you could say that's a form of the Indian government acting in a kind of neo-colonial way, because the British did the exact same thing. So I do think there's some parallels there. Yeah, so that is a great question. And I think that a lot of social scientists and historians, in a kind of pushback to this colonial, into studies about colonial influence, have made the argument that you're making, which is, how do we know that some of these conflicts did not exist even before the British or any European powers got to India? So I think that I would say a few things in response. So number one, I think you're right that there were definitely tribal revolts or low caste revolts that occurred before the British. In fact, I think that there was the one data set that I saw that had a list of peasant rebellions that happened during the time of Emperor Akbar, right? So that is in the 16th century. So I definitely think that the conflict pre-existed colonialism. The main problem, I think, with how we study this is that, when I show you, when I showed this this huge list of variables that I use in the paper, we have such good data for the British period because they're very good at writing reports and collecting data. So everything is in the National Archives or in the British Library or in the British Library in the UK. And so we have all of this information about where did different castes live and where was their mining operations. But for the pre-colonial period, we really don't have that data. And so it's very hard to at least do this kind of study, like a quantitative study, just because there's so much we don't know about that period. So I think that is really the province of historians who would maybe know how to read classical Persian or various other languages that were being used at the time, and collecting that data. But when we set out to do this topic, we didn't have access to any of that, so we really had to limit ourselves to the colonial period. Right? So I think, if anything, the argument we'd make is that there were pre-existing tensions that were probably exacerbated by colonialism. So, and I think that there are some policies that you could, I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say new, but they approach something that we might call new. So if you think about like zamindari tenure, I mean, that was something that there was no history in Bengal of anything like that. So that is, so you could say in pre-colonial Bengal, you already had these hierarchies that the British are exploiting, but they come and make a new change, which is the introduction of private property that is completely that doesn't really fit with anything that's happened in Bengal. So I think there's a way that what you're saying and what we're saying in the paper can both be correct. It's just about, instead of saying British rule caused something, you could say exacerbated or further intensified a pre-existing conflict. So first, if you just want to think about the Naxalites, I mean, there were Naxalites that operated in Kerala, but only really in the Malabar region. So that's not a surprise that they would have mobilized in the British, in the former British areas. Yes, yeah, right. So first you have this. First, you have the Naxalite issue, that's separate, and then you're talking about the Malabar in the 1920s. Yeah, so you have a huge refugee issue at that time also, and that is, traditionally kind of described as a Hindu-Muslim conflict, although there's also a caste, I think, dimension to the conflict, because there were a lot of the Muslims who took part in that conflict were recent converts from untouchable castes in Hinduism. So you have a huge, I think, refugee issue in the north that you don't have in the south. And in Kochi and Travancore, these are, I think their gun salutes are both 17 to 19. They're very, on the higher end. And the British repeatedly talk about the enlightened rulers of Kochi and Travancore, and very often said about the rulers in North India, if only the princes in North India would act like the people in Travancore, then we wouldn't have so many problems. We wouldn't have to constantly argue with the princes about things. So yeah, I do think that if you wanted to apply it to the Malabar Rebellion, Mappila Revolt, and also refugee crises in Kerala, you could definitely see the distinction between colonial and non-colonial. Yeah, so the argument is that in British areas you have an exacerbation of the caste issue, caste tensions, and in princely areas you didn't have the same level of caste discrimination. And so, of course, the temple entry movement in Travancore and the temple entry proclamation is a perfect example of very often princely rulers try to have, also not just Kerala, but also in Baroda and Gwalior and other parts of India, they had government directives that tried to deal with caste discrimination. So the Maharaja of Travancore allows untouchables to go into Hindu temples. That didn't happen in any part of British India, right? So you had caste reformers, I think, more in the princely areas. And so that's why you would see the breakdown of the strong social hierarchies of caste in the south. But in Malabar, you didn't have the same, you did have missionaries, but you don't see the same breakdown of the caste hierarchy. And even if you look at the survey data in Kerala, people tend to say in the south that they have more trust of police than somewhere in Malabar where there's much more distrust towards the police or other kinds of colonial era institutions. So in general, I would say British exacerbate these tensions, but in princely areas, especially among the more enlightened princely rulers, the states that have higher gun salutes, you would have the breakdown of some of these hierarchies. Right, so our view is that if you're thinking about British India, first you start with provinces and princely states. So you say provinces are areas where you actually have British officials, not a large number, but you have British officials living in these areas, and you have British institutions. So you have the police, you have the civil service, you have district administration. So you compare that with princely states where basically in a lot of these princely kingdoms, the only British official you have is the resident, right? There's just one kind of individual who is the slender thread that ties together the British and the princely government. So we start with that. We say, British provinces areas, you have this district level administration, and then princely areas, you have some kind of native government. And so within that, we can say not all provinces are the same and not all princely states are the same. So if you look at the 3 presidencies of British India, you would say that there was much more direct British influence in Bengal than there was in Madras. Because in Bengal, you had zamindari tenure, you had all of these major changes, but then in the south, you had Rayatwari, so there's less British influence there, fewer British officials. And then within princely states, you would draw a distinction between, you have places like Travancore, Gwalior, Baroda, that have basically one kind of British official there, the resident. And then you have smaller princely states where you have a number of British officials there. And they're trying to, so in Bastar, they try to model a lot of the way that the British district administration works on provinces. So they're trying to copy that level of that organizational structure. So by influence, I am really talking about how many British officials are there, what are the institutions that are there, like the police, or like the civil service does not exist in the princely states, right? The civil service is really only for British India. So how many British officials are there? What are the institutions? And then how are they actually organizing politics? But mainly British influence, the way we use it in the paper is a kind of quantitative measure, but this is qualitatively what we're looking at. Yeah, so the fact that the Naxalite movement is traditionally dated to this initial rebellion in 1967 in West Bengal, or that you have some Naxal conflict here in Kerala. I mean, these are some of the most vibrant leftist movements that you have in India. And I think that usually what happens in a lot of these, same thing happened in Chhattisgarh or other areas. Usually what you have is a break between left parties, where you have some leftists who say we should try to do this parliamentary, and we should run for office, and we should do these things. And then usually most of the Maoists said that we should just abandon electoral politics, and we have to get involved in a revolutionary struggle. And so I think they're trying to co-opt each other. And I think that if you look at, people always ask me about this. People always say, like, what happened in 2010? And really, that's when you start to see, or around that time is the implementation of the NREGA, right? Like this rural employment guarantee, which is really an attempt to try to co-opt the Naxalites and say, we will give people guaranteed, some amount of guaranteed work, and we'll try to increase social services. And then since that time, the Naxalite movement has really declined. So I do think that that there was a break in these left parties, but if the goal of the Naxalites was to overthrow the Indian government, they failed. If the goal was to get more development in these areas, then you could say that they succeeded in a sense, because the MREGA is the largest welfare scheme in the world. And so I don't know if that would have had the same success if not for this decades of fighting from the Naxalites. Yeah, we don't really have, I mean, none of the data that we have really allows us to do any kind of analysis on gender. I mean, I know other scholars like Alpa Shah or others who are ethnographers who have actually, or even Arundhati Roy wrote a piece, Walking with the Naxalites, have talked about one mobilization tool that Naxalites have used, which is the sexual exploitation of women by high caste men or high caste landlords, and also the government has at times used sexual violence against women during the Naxalite conflict. So I do think there's a story there in terms of mobilizing women into the movement, but I don't know if we have data on like what percentage of the Naxals are women. I mean, maybe you know about that. I don't think I've ever seen, all we have is just information about how many people there are, but I don't know if it's broken down by gender. Why should we trust British data? Yeah, that's a good question. So, so really, actually, almost all the data we have is from the Indian government, not from the British government. It's from the Indian. So it's a question of how much you trust the Indian government. The only data that we have from the British is about how many years they were in a particular district, or the gun salutes. That data we got from British documents. But actually all the other data, like soil quality, percentage of people who are scheduled caste, literacy rate, those are all from the census. And so I do think you're right that you have to be careful, because like a number of development economists say, we don't really know what the literacy rate in India is. Because very often literacy means you can write your name, and that's it, right? So if it's the kind of literacy test you would use in other countries, then your literacy rate might decrease by like 5 or 10 percentage points. So we do kind of uncritically use government data, but I think that I'm not sure what else you would do about that. I mean, some of our data comes from the Human Development Survey, which is not government, that's from an NGO. So that is based on a survey. So you could say maybe you have a little more credibility there. And then the violence data comes from press reports. So we have Ministry of Home Affairs data, but they could be lying about how much violence there is. So we use data from the South Asia Terrorism Portal uses data from press reports. So if it's reported in a newspaper, they say there was a Naxal attack. The government says 2 people died, but the journalist says no, 20 people died. Then we have different sources of data, so that way we can kind of triangulate what we're talking about. But I do agree with you that you have to be careful about who you trust. Yeah. Why was 2010 so violent? I did some interviews with government officials in Jharkhand I'm sorry, not Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh and in Hyderabad. And I asked this was around the time that NREGA, they were being implemented. And so I said, what was the Naxal response? And they would say, well, the Naxalites are very worried about NREGA because they feel like this will cut into their influence. So they had been attacking a lot of development projects. So government officials said, we're trying to build a dam, but the Naxalites have tried to blow up the dam. Or we're trying to build roads in this district, but the Naxalites attacked us and we couldn't finish. So I think that why 2010 was so violent was it's the last attempt, I think, of the Naxalites to try to prevent. They're not opposed to development, but they want to be the ones who develop these areas. Like they try to set up their own shadow government. And I think in 2010, they're trying to prevent the Indian government from actually doing this development because they realize if these villagers start to get more money or more income, then that's going to affect their movement. So I think that's why it was such a violent year, but they didn't succeed. And you have NREGA, and so that's why you see a decline in violence. Your second question about Hyderabad, yeah, so Hyderabad is probably the toughest case. Like Bastar has no gun salute, but Hyderabad has a 21, I think, gun salute. And I think the Nizam of Hyderabad is the only one who has the title of His Exalted Highness. He worked very hard to make sure that that was his title. So what I would say about Hyderabad is that it's the largest princely state. And so most of the conflict is happening out in the rural areas where you have, one of the Nizam's Diwans had tried to implement private property reforms in these areas, Salarjung, right? So he tried to implement some of these reforms, and that really increased the power of landlords in rural areas. And the original fight in Telangana was about that. So we would say that that was like an attempt to mimic some of the British land reforms, which backfired in Hyderabad. So that's how we explain it, but I do agree with you. Hyderabad is, I think, the toughest case for our theory is about averages. On average, you will have more violence in British areas, but there are some British areas that have no Naxalite conflict. There's not a lot of Naxalite conflict in Maharashtra, for example. And there are some princely states like Hyderabad where you do have violence, but on average, we would say that's not the average story. Hyderabad's kind of an exceptional case. Yeah, so we do have a variable here for land inequality. So we do look at that across every district in India. And then we do have measures of caste conflict from the Human Development Survey in each area. So again, on average, there's more caste conflict and more inequality in British areas. But in some princely states, you might not see that relationship. I mean, that's just you're on average, you won't see that relationship. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, or I would say before 1858, you might have more British interest on religion. I mean, they spent a lot of time trying to learn about Hinduism and Islam. But after 1858, I think you're right. The emphasis is on caste because the British are coming from Victorian England, which is one of the most hierarchical class societies in the world at that time. And so when they see the Indian caste system, they say this is very similar to what we have back home. We have servants and we have people who are born into different classes. There's not a lot of social mobility. So I would say, yeah, there's a lot more influence on caste after 1858. Yeah, two good questions. So the first question about whether the Naxalites are trying to topple development schemes or prevent exploitation. So the argument that they're trying to topple development schemes was from interviews I did with the government officials. So of course their view is that the Naxalites are trying to prevent development and they are being very self-interested. So of course, I didn't get to speak to any Naxalite leaders because that's not easy to do. But I'm sure that what they would have said is what you're saying, that they're trying to prevent, that these development schemes, even if they actually improve lives for villagers, are a kind of neoliberal, it's a kind of neoliberal program, right? Because these are foreign companies and that you're going to have a lot of natural resources that are looted and very little money is actually going to come back in these communities. So I think that that's probably, both of those things could be true, but I mentioned the toppling of development schemes because that's what kind of government officials in that area told me. But I think what you're saying is also probably correct. Right. Yeah. So so they wouldn't even agree on what development means, right? A government official and a Naxalite leader. So development in what sense, and then development for whom, or who is really benefiting. And if its villagers are not benefiting and it's corporations, then it's not development the Naxalites want. That's what I would say. I'm sorry, remind me, your second question was about UP, right? And why we see, and British land reforms. So I think kind of after all of these rebellions that happened in the 19th century, there was just like one wave after wave after wave of revolts all throughout kind of northeastern and the southeastern India. I think the British realized the effect that some of their original land policies like zamindari rule were having. So I think in the South, for example, it was Monroe, Thomas Monroe actually he took a boat and went back to London because the British East India Company wanted to implement zamindari tenure in the South. And he went 3 weeks back to London and had a meeting with the board of officials and said, don't implement zamindari rule because it will cause all kinds of problems. And he personally convinced them to do that. So I do think over time they realized some of their land reforms had not worked. So yes, I think in UP you could say that you have less conflict because of some of these land reforms. Also, you started to see the reservation of certain areas for scheduled tribe groups, and that also kind of began during the colonial period, where you had reserved areas that were no one else was supposed to cohabit those areas with tribals. But I think the bigger story is post-colonial land reforms and the fact that like in the 1950s, there were all of these attempts to abolish zamindari tenure, and most of those did not work. Most of those failed, and so I am concerned less with what the British tried to do was after all of these rebellions near the end of British rule. So I don't think that it was a pretty half-hearted attempt, I think, at reform. In the 1950s, with the abolition of Zamindari Act, those land reforms are the ones that I think if they had been successful, you would have not seen the mobilization in the 60s and 70s. But I don't think any of those post-colonial reforms were very successful. So one common thing people did, zamindars did, was they just distributed land title deeds to all of their family members. So they would say, okay, you're only allowed to own 50 acres of land, and they would have 500 acres, so they just give 50 acres to every family member that they could find, and then they retain all of the land. So I think most of those reforms failed, and that's why you see most of the conflicts today. So I would focus more, I guess, on post-colonial rather than colonial land reforms.